So you can see the question. That really tells you a lot. Anyway, I just want to thank again Professor Knuckles and the Anthropology Department, and also give a special thanks to Professor Hancock of the Political Science Department, and also to the students from the Tocqueville Society who came out last night for dinner and what I found to be a very interesting discussion. Let me ground the sort of question and assume, how many of you have taken a political theory course? Okay, so a good chunk of you, but not everybody. Okay, I mean, one of the classic questions in political theory that gets really raised by Rousseau and then in some ways Marx is, what's the relationship between political democracy, a society in which each of us have, at least in theory, an equal voice in the making of the laws that bind us, the laws that we should obey because we've had an equal voice in the making of it, and social and economic inequality. In other words, what degrees of inequality exist, and are they so great that in some ways threatens the equal voice of all of us in politics? Now, that was a focus of a lot of people who come out of the sort of democratic left tradition that I do, which believes very firmly in the value of political and civil liberties, and thus would reject, as any sort of democratic society, authoritarian communist ones, but also believes you need a certain degree of social rights and social equality in order to deepen the value of political and civil rights for everyone. You know, in a certain sense, to situate myself, I would be somewhere in the sort of European, West European social democratic tradition, which we can talk about its issues, whether it's in crisis, whatever. But actually, that was something that motivated a lot of political theory in the 1960s and 1970s. Questions about, can you have a really democratic society if the workplace is not democratic? People like the feminist theorist Carol Pateman wrote a lot about this. My thesis advisor, Michael Walzer. There was tremendous work by a Canadian theorist who, in some of his Marxist commitments I might not agree with, but C.B. McPherson. But in the 80s, 90s, and onwards, if you viewed yourself as somewhat critical of maybe the status quo, say, in Western political democracies or, say, the United States, you probably, if you were in political theory or even a political activist, you were more talking about identity politics, more about the importance of difference, of affirming, which is important. Part of a liberal democratic society is pluralism. I mean, many of you know that it's important that a liberal democratic society protect the rights of particular communities to define their particular view of the good life, how to, you know, what is sort of a moral way of life, whatever. But on the other hand, in a democratic society, there also have to be certain values, say commitment to democracy itself, to civil rights itself, that we all share, or else you really can have the center of democracy not really holding because you have all these particular groups conflicting. But sort of people who would define themselves on the left, who call themselves difference theorists, really emphasized, and one can understand this, the importance of particular communities based, usually they would talk more around race and gender, sometimes nationality, upon occasion maybe religion, but that those communities really were where we shaped our identity, found our sort of particular view of sort of the good, really shaped our vision of morality, and that universal values, say like democratic citizenship, like all of us being citizens, sharing certain values, or just sharing values as human beings, these were overly, in their view, abstract universal norms that usually masked. There was a suspicion of universal norms because it would mask generally the views of what is the good life, what is justice of the powerful. And again, maybe some of you have taken gender studies courses or whatever, where there might be a suspicion that universal norms of equality, citizenship, equal respect, solidarity across differences could mask a dominant white male, sort of wealthy or privileged perspective. And I think that's sometimes true, but you know, my work would argue that if there's nothing that holds us in common across different forms of identity, if there isn't sort of a common identity of democratic citizenship, then it's very hard to sustain not only a pluralist society, but a democratic, egalitarian and plural society. A sort of theoretical approach that a few of you might be aware of, but probably is not as prevalent as talk about diversity or the value of pluralism and difference. Here might be sort of the post-structuralist critique of any form of sort of universal comprehensive moral norms. Some of you might have been exposed to this if you've taken some literary theory courses, whatever. But post-structuralism in a nutshell, this is there used to be a series called Classic Comic Books that had like intellectual history or whatever. This is my sort of Wikipedia version of post-structuralism. But it started off as a literary move, which said that basically texts are not, there isn't one right reading of a text, of a novel, whatever, because texts are, quote, readerly, because there's always a gap. This was sort of Jacques Derrida's argument between language or words as signifiers, what they signify allegedly, and signifiers and the signified. There's always a gap in meaning, and what we interpret when we read a text is really specific to our own interpretive framework, and there's no one right universal reading. Now, that might or might not be true in regards to text. Hint, I think they're better and worse readings, more intelligent, whatever. The argument was that you can never really know the author's intention. Who knows, they're dead, or they may not even psychologically know what they really intended. So these texts sort of are free-floating and open to radical different interpretations. But the second move that you'll learn if you ever study with somebody who comes out of a post-structuralist tradition is that there are no foundational universal truths, particularly universal moral truths. It basically says that, and this is a difficult question that moral philosophers grapple with all the time. If you assert that all human beings are created equally, A, what does that mean? Equal in what ways? But also you can't, some of us might point to some sort of universal human potentiality we think might exist. Rousseau and Marx thought there was a human potentiality to sort of for autonomy, to have democratic self-governance. Hobbes and Locke more thought that there was a common human nature, that people had very different desires, but we all had desires to freely choose our way of life, which is sort of the classical liberal tradition. There are other sort of more sort of universal doctrines based on views of human potentiality. You could go back to the ancients, certainly to Aristotle, who thought because human beings are capable of speech and of deliberating about what is the good life, what is moral, we have the potential to be moral animals, and that distinguishes us from all other beings. And there are better or worse forms of moral or immoral lives. Post-structuralists are very suspicious of this, in that they think, and this is something that where they share some ways the American pragmatic philosophical tradition, people like William James and later the literary critic and philosopher Richard Rorty, that there's no definitive way of proving a moral claim. It's not like you can pick up a rock and it says, God says all human beings are created equal. Or if you say something racist, the thunderbolt comes down and kills you. There's no irrefutable, a priori, irrefutable proof of a moral claim. On the other hand, there's a rich tradition, which I'm more sympathetic to. You can be sort of an Aristotelian, or you can be coming out of a sort of Rousseauian or sort of democratic Marxist tradition, and we can talk about whether that's an oxymoron. That human beings do show, or Hegelian sort of, show over history a desire for greater freedom. Nobody wants to be tortured or imprisoned for their beliefs or, persecuted because of their religious beliefs. This seems to be somewhat across cultures, and human beings seem to show over history a desire to have freer and, more equitable and more commodious is the fancy word, but more sort of materially sort of supportive or a higher quality of life, both politically, civilly, and materially. And Francis Fukuyama, for example, who is more sort of a moderate Hegelian or something, in his work on, the end of history, argues this in terms of liberal democracy, liberal democratic capitalism being the fullest, freest society. But post-structuralists would be very suspicious about that because, A, they don't believe they're foundational truths, but also in a reaction, I think a healthy reaction in a way, to the Marxist tradition they were arguing about. There's no teleology to history. There's no final end where history ends, but also where we have the definitively good society. And this view, in a certain sense, it's very critical of the Enlightenment tradition, which I'll say I'm sort of a critical supporter of, and we can talk about this. There's certain problems with Enlightenment views about who is human, what is rational, whatever, but I still think the Enlightenment belief that human beings are capable through reason and discussion and deliberation and open and tolerant argument to create better, more democratic, freer societies. But they really argue that the Enlightenment view of reason is one where technology dominates nature, where the ones who are deemed more rational dominate those who are deemed irrational, and that there really is no, and that sort of reason itself is a historical and social construct that is not necessarily liberating, emancipatory. It comes out of, I mean, in some ways, again, even people who are more into the Enlightenment tradition know that there's a dark side to the Enlightenment, right? Science gives us this room, it gives us PowerPoint, which can be good or bad, right? Technology is not necessarily moral, or, GE doesn't necessarily bring better light in the sense of moral light, which is, they claimed in the 60s, GE, or 70s, you're probably too young to remember, the ad was GE brings good things to light, which is the Enlightenment brings things, science, technology. Because science can give us, indoor plumbing, hot and cold showers. None of us would abandon that. Probably most people who are in cultures that don't have indoor plumbing, once they experience it, want to keep it probably. And hot showers are hard to give up, even if you grew up in a place where you didn't have hot showers. Ask anybody who grew up, as many of my older friends did, with just outhouses. Once they got indoor plumbing, they preferred it. But a lot of post-structuralists would be suspicious of that claim because, of course, technology can also give you the gas chambers. It can give you the Holocaust, right? In other words, technology can both emancipate us, it can also literally destroy humanity. So they're being very suspicious of the rational subject, of a liberatory direction to history, that also they were very suspicious, and I think this is a good suspicion, that some of the more, the Marxist tradition often assumed that one's structural position in, say, society, in a political economy, determined your consciousness, or in the long run did, so that working people, because they working class, didn't control capital, didn't control the corporations for which they worked it for, but they worked together intersubjectively. Ultimately, they would come to a consciousness of wanting to have democratic control over the political economy. They would come to socialist consciousness. There are lots of people who are working class, even in societies where socialist movements have been strong for various moral, political, ethical, cultural reasons, are apolitical, conservative, centrist, Christian Democrats, whatever. So, I mean, I think that was a healthy view. But then the post-structuralist argument, which, again, you may not have been exposed to, but if you read Wendy Brown, these are sort of the people I'm thinking about, William Connolly, very prominent political theorist, very heavily influenced by the post-structural literary critic Judith Butler. They basically argue that politics, democratic politics, should be an open, agonal struggle, a real conflict, not armed, but ethical conflict over how we live our lives in common. But there's no one right answer, and everything's open. They claim to be left Nietzscheans, left-wing followers of Nietzsche. But, what if the Ubermenches, or the dominant class, or racists, or whatever, people who are really dictators, win this open struggle? Don't you, if you're committed to democratic political conflict, aren't there some quasi-foundational views about political, civil, social rights you have to embrace? Even if we can't definitively prove it, we have to act as if we really believe in it. Or else, if everybody should have an equal voice, how do we say that, repressive voices, or voices that are armed, should not be legitimated? That armed force is out of the question in a democratic society, the use of armed force to gain power. So the interesting question to me, and what I'm trying to talk about, is why did people who claim to be radical sort of abandon any belief that human beings are of equal moral worth, and that we need to think of societies where democratically we make binding decisions of laws that affect us all, and maybe binding decisions over economic life, how we invest the wealth we all create together, or how we run the firms or the universities in which we live and work. Should they be run democratically? They abandon that more to talk about either difference and the importance of sort of affirming particular communities, or they talked about the fact that we shouldn't talk about equality or citizenship or universal commitments to political and civil rights, because these are just other forms of, and some of you may have read Michel Foucault or been taught Foucault, these are other forms of power, knowledge, discourses, of wills to power, of trying to impose through allegedly shared norms a particular form of power that would run through all of us and sort of norm us to behave in certain ways, which is why if anybody reads Judith Butler, her argument is that human beings constitute who they are, not by some free individual choice, but by being normed by various this is sort of from Foucault, micro-institutions, local institutions like the university, the school system, hospitals, the asylum, the local government, the local zoning thing. We all take these norms of what it is to be, say, a straight white male, or to be an American, whatever that means, and these concepts of power and norming and what it is natural to be run through us and sort of create us. And therefore, she says, we sort of recreate ourselves by just what she calls performatively performing these sort of norms and expectations, what it is to be a good American, what it is to be a good citizen, what it is to be a loyal child, whatever. And that the only form of sort of resistance to these norms, if they are oppressive, is what she calls performative resistance. That is, you transgress. Maybe some of you have heard of this, but sort of transgression is sort of, if you're a young sort of radical hipster, you're going to transgress the norm that you ought to, embrace the work ethic or whatever. And of course, one of the big transgressing things is to violate traditional gender norms. And in fact, some of Butler's early work and a lot of queer theorists' work is about sort of how drag is a transgressive, performative act of resistance because you're not conforming to the normal way we perform gender. And gender is sort of the first, the argument, Butler goes even more radical in that she thinks that even sexuality, male, female, biologically is somewhat socially constructed. But certainly most people in gender studies would say gender is socially constructed. Male versus female, what it is to be male or female. Are there societies where there isn't really a concept of straight versus gay or whatever? But there's certain structural realities in life, I would argue, that this view that we can always performatively resist, that if you're somewhat of a materialist or you believe social structures do affect lives, it's hard to really perform your way out of being bossed. It's, if the boss gives you orders and you violate them, you can be fired. You can't, even if you don't laugh at their jokes, right? We all know this, that yes, you can kind of performally resist a professor whose expectations and arguments and assignments you don't really like, or you even think you disagree with them. There's some lefty crazy person named Schwartz teaching your political theory course. He's telling you all about equality and how you need economic equality to have political equality. You don't really buy it, you're more libertarian and stuff, but you want an A in the course. I always tell my students that I'm more interested in intelligent conservative arguments than stupid radical arguments that people give me that they think I will like. But you know what I mean. There's all the, you're constrained because you may get a low grade, right? So it's easy to talk about transgressing. And even in regards to, say, sexuality and gender, Matthew Shepard in Wyoming didn't have as much possibilities of transgressing than if you're at some, and even then there's sometimes homophobic violence or whatever, but it's much more constraining, to grow up there gay than, say, if you were, in a hyper-liberal, liberal arts campus, you can pick your favorites, Oberlin, Bard, whatever, so that there are structural realities to culture and to norms that can't just be sort of performatively resisted, and also certain norms often make sense. Yes, the norm of what it is to be sane is socially constructed, whatever, but there are definitely people, I think across cultures, who probably, if schizophrenic, it's hard to be self-governing. It's hard to run your own life. People may need assistance from charity, from the state, from institutions to lead a halfway decent life if they're in some ways disabled. And again, disability is socially constructed, and how to integrate certain forms of disabled people is obviously a political question, but there are certain sort of social and material realities that you can't just reduce to norming. So, what does this mean for all of what I'm sort of concerned about? Whatever. I think what's interesting is, in a way, a lot of political theorists who would claim they're committed to some form of democracy, whatever, spent the last 30 years really talking more about difference and more about the sort of norming nature of shared values at a time when I think our society grew radically different, not just in cultural ways, where I think there is more cultural diversity perhaps than there were 30 or 40 years ago, but in economic ways there's much greater inequality. And I think that form of difference really does threaten political democracy in many ways. And they didn't really talk much about it. But also there is a question, and we face this in regards to sort of, say, the question about a path to citizenship or not for immigrants. What should be the shared norms and values of democracy? In other words, what holds us together as well as separates us? And I'll give you an example of where I think affirming difference without talking about what bonds of common humanity and common moral responsibilities we have across differences. What common shared responsibilities and obligations do we have as citizens across differences of religion, of ethnicity, of immigrant versus native-born status, et cetera. A lot of Americans of all races who live in suburbs really do think that poor inner-city people, disproportionately black and Latino, or poor people in general, of which 40% of people in poverty in the United States are white, the largest poor group, as growing up in, if some of you have grown up in Utah, you would know that. They really think that people who are poor are very culturally different. They don't have a work ethic, even though industrial jobs in many of those communities disappeared, whatever. But we really don't have any common moral obligations. We pay our suburban, property taxes. We have really good public schools in these areas. And we don't really have a sort of responsibility to think seriously about why schools for poorer children of all races don't have as good results. Should we even have racially and class segregated schools in America? Our public schools are very segregated by race and class because of federalism and zoning laws, and the fact that most affluent suburbs are not very diverse socioeconomically, let alone racially. That difference is not necessarily democratic. That difference isn't necessary to be affirmed. And you can even get, sometimes if you get very kind of narrowly nationalist sort of ethnic studies programs, and Temple is sort of the founding place of sort of an Afrocentric form of Africana studies that basically argues that if people of African descent really understood the shared sort of cultural values of solidarity, individuality, cooperativeness of the West African cultures from which most descendants of American slaves came from, then there would be really an empowerment of the African-American community. And they literally say that people who talk about socioeconomic equality or the need for more jobs, or that there's sort of problems with the political economy of the inner city, and that may be why there's a lot of poverty, really are thinking in economic and political terms that are white, and European. And I just think that's kind of crazy off the record. But the question is, cultural identity isn't necessarily empowering. I mean, sometimes it obviously is in many ways. We all draw on our particular culture, whether it be that we're of Irish background, or we're kind of middle American, or we're brought up in the LDS community, or whatever. That all helps form us. But those identities are not necessarily going to generate democratic equality for people who come from communities who are denied basic access to economic resources or political resources or good education, whatever. So that's one of my main real concerns. The other concern is that I do think that while I believe in sort of democratic pluralism and open conflict among different democratic views, I do think we do have to have some shared moral commitment to liberal democratic values, or else you could get the war of all against all with the most powerful groups, whether they be armed or they be extremely wealthy. If you're worried about the role of money in politics, I mean, we do have a problem where, the cost of elections in 1976, in today's dollars, the presidential, House, and Senate races in 1976 cost $1 billion in total. In 2012 dollars. In 2012, it cost $6.2 billion. The average winner for a House race in today's dollars in 1976 only had to raise $300,000. Today, the average House winner had to raise $1.4 million. The average Senate winner, U.S. Senate, in 1976 raised $3 million in today's dollars. In 2012, $11 million. So basically, the cost of getting elected has risen 4 or 5 times, and you might say that doesn't matter, but there is a problem if 90% of campaign contributions come from the top 10% of the American income strata, people who give money to politics. And and what was I going to say? 60% come from the top 1%. And in terms of money from groups, yes, there's some money from labor and from public citizen organizations and from Move On and stuff. But about 75% of campaign money comes from various industry and trade associations and through various forms of PACs or super PACs or now not-for-profit sort of social welfare groups, 501c4s, that aren't supposed to spend money on lobbying, but they can give money for politically informative ads, according to Citizens United. Most of that is from the corporate sector. There are divisions among the corporate sector, whatever. But if you're concerned about that, you can't really just say everything should be an open agonal struggle. Every group just goes out and dukes it out. I mean, what if you're worried about the role of do wealthy interests have more power than ordinary interests, you have to have some criteria to judge. So that I think that saying that, a democracy is going to be, many of them talk about they're for ethics created through democratic sort of struggle, but they believe we're going to be an amoral society because any sort of shared morality is really going to be imposed by some on others. I think the democratic project does involve our kind of trying to work out through political contest, argument, some sort of minimal shared moral commitments. I mean, I don't want to go into sort of John Rawls, but, we can have our particular view of the good life, of how, and there shouldn't be a state religion, there shouldn't be a ban on religion, or there shouldn't be everybody should be members of the state religion. We shouldn't tell people whether they should raise their children strictly or, more liberally. Although I do think the state should act, we should have a moral consensus that physical abuse of children or physical violence against one's partners, violence against women, the state should intervene. The state should intervene against child abuse. Of course, we have to politically define what is abusive treatment of children. But if there are no real shared universal moral norms that we agree upon, say political equality, civil rights, some degree of social rights, we still have a consensus. It could be changed politically, but I do think we think that people who are unemployed should get some support from the entire society through unemployment insurance. We think that nobody who's elderly, if they had a job where they couldn't save much, but they've worked for more than 10 years, they qualify for Social Security. There should be some minimal old age insurance. We sort of have a consensus right now that the elderly and low-income people and their children should get some sort of support from a publicly funded Medicare and Medicaid system. Whether we have a full consensus that we should move to more universal health care as a social right, we'll argue about. But unless we have some minimal shared commitment to political, civil, and social rights, I think it's hard to sustain a democratic society. So I would conclude by arguing that I think if you're a Democrat, whether you're a conservative Democrat with a small d, in other words, whether you're a Republican who believes in political and civil liberties, or a moderate Democrat, capital D, who believes in civil liberties, or a social democrat who wants to argue we need not only to defend political and civil liberties, but also democratically try to expand social rights. I think we all ultimately believe in some ways, shared ways, the equal moral worth of persons. Or else, why should we care if certain groups have been historically disempowered? Why should we care if you don't have a universal norm, say, of merit, which many people would, I think, is constructed through politics, but I don't think it's arbitrary. I mean, it's socially constructed. But if we think that, say, just judging people's potential for university work should be judged just by grades and SATs, and we think that SATs somewhat are not really fair judgments of the educational potential of children of all races, by the way, and that's why I'm for affirmative consideration for university admissions of white students from low-income backgrounds, or more importantly, from backgrounds where their parents are not college educated. The best predictor of SAT performance are two variables, and they're very powerful predictors. A, did one or two of your parents go to a university in the United States? And if both did, you're going to, on average, score higher. And then two, what were their SAT scores? I mean, my kid would have, if he hadn't had high SATs, shame on him, and then his mother has a Yale PhD and I have a Harvard PhD, and we use big words all the freaking time. I mean, I'm not saying it's one-on-one. It's not direct. Nothing that statistically, provable means that everybody, the statistics of small numbers are highly insignificant. But, in other words, there are kids who grow up in affluent families with university-educated parents who are goof-offs, or whatever, or get into sex, drugs, and rock and roll when they're 15. It's kind of a cruel system where what you're like at 15 or 16 kind of has a heavy influence on the whole life because, as you well know, even at this campus, people are distracted at ages 17, 18, 19, whatever. Many people, and it's probably one of the reasons why students who go on missions probably come back and do very well often. People who are in the military, a lot of my working class students who've served in the military do best because they're more disciplined than the average 18-year-old. Right? But in any event, the other thing, though, that I think we all should be concerned about, and I think if we just say, oh, it's difference, should we care if they're just all these different communities? Here's a striking statistic that I think we should all be worried about, or I'll conclude with two things that I think we all should be worried about, which is, one is, should students increasingly be responsible for financing through their own personal or family resources their education? There was a time in this country only 30 years ago where states spent per pupil for higher education, per pupil who was in higher education, and now they're somewhat more, but not much more than the mid-'70s because of the rise. And the U.S. used to be graduated 25%. 25% of people under 30 in the United States in the mid-'70s had college degrees, up from only 8% right after World War II. The GI Bill, the growth of state universities, whatever. But now it's about 28%, from 25 to 28. And Europe, which used to be sort of 15 back then, has caught up and surpassed us because their universities are somewhat more affordable. But should students have to finance their own education, which increasingly they do because the federal, but particularly state governments, have cut back, and now you have the reality where the University of Utah is more expensive than BYU, and obviously BYU, 80% of the cost of this university are supported by the church, right? But if you don't go to an institution where there's a community that really communally supports students, it can be very expensive. I mean, you're getting as good an education as most elite Eastern universities. My kid goes to Wesleyan University in Connecticut. I'm sure you're getting the same type of professors, same type of education, have comparable sort of students in terms of their preparation, whatever. And fortunately, his mom teaching at Cornell, they pay a third of his tuition. But basically, if we pay $40,000 a year, and we can afford it because we're both tenured full professors. But a lot of middle strata people, unless you're quite poor, you're not going to get much aid. You're going to be told to take out loans. And the average student is graduating with $25,000 in loans. I mean, is that a type of social difference we should affirm? And then the other thing to really worry about, and this is where socioeconomic inequality, I think, does thwart equality of opportunity at times. If you look at, this is the reality of American education. I'll conclude with this, and it's one of the reasons why I still believe not just in difference, I am a pluralist, and not just in the fact that many of our values are constructed through social contestation, argument. They're not given by, some sort of human nature or some sort of theological truths or whatever. But I do believe in democratic equality, and I think a democratic society we'll argue about it, but it has to be kind of a value that we at least all agree we're trying to figure out how to institutionalize. Here's another statistic that's very scary to me. In 8th grade sort of assessment tests, which now exist in all states, and in fact there may be, some sort of common curriculum, students who perform, let me get this right, in the top third in 8th grade, if they are in top third, so they're fairly strong students, they do in the top third of kind of national assessment tests in 8th grade, they're in the top third. If they're in the top quintile, if their parents are in the top 20% of the income stream, they're 80% likely to graduate from a 4-year institution. If they're in the bottom 20%, they're like 35% likely to graduate from a 4-year institution. And here's where it gets very scary. Students who perform in the bottom third of the exams, if their parents are in the top quintile of the income stream, in other words, their parents are kind of professional, managerial, high-level civil servants, professors. If they're in the bottom third, they're like 55% likely to graduate from university, or 50. But remember that the low-income kids, the bottom quintile, who finished in the top third, they're only 35% likely to get degrees versus if they were in the top fifth, 80%. And the bottom third of the people who perform in the bottom third of these exams in 8th grade who come from the poorest quintile, the bottom, so the lower income families, only 8% of them will graduate from college versus 50% of kids with the same scores from affluent families. And that's not probably going to be as true in LDS families because you have a community and an institution and a church that supports in some ways, more equality of opportunity across socioeconomic differences. But to make that argument that we should worry about it really means that regardless of what particular community people grow up in, whether it be, immigrant, whether it be white working class, whether it be African American, whatever, that we should be worried that there should be equality of opportunity for all citizens, regardless of income. And I'll conclude with another provocative statement. I think if you contribute meaningful labor to a society, and the society wants that labor, encourages that labor, allows people to come into a country and stay for many years, I think those working people who take care of people like my 93-year-old mother, undocumented immigrants or documented immigrants, plus their children, should have an immediate road to citizenship. In fact, I think they should have citizenship, period. I think if we want less immigration, we have to change our domestic and international economic policy. I can talk about it, but we do a lot of things to push people out of rural societies to their cities, and then they can't get jobs because American agribusiness basically destroyed small-scale Mexican agriculture. And then we have, not the sucking sound so much of jobs going out, which Ross Perot used to talk about, which we have somewhat, but there's a huge demand for low-income labor at such low income and such hard working conditions, particularly in agriculture, but also domestic care, long hours, 24-hour, full-week shifts, taking care of the elderly in their homes, that only really immigrants will do it. A lot of native-born Americans, including people whose parents were immigrants, have a reserve wage. They just don't want jobs breaking their backs and being crippled by 40 picking strawberries, or living, there is a Ghanaian immigrant woman who's documented, has a green card, who I'm pretty sure my mother, being a left-wing economist and having saved a lot of her time, pays her fair wages much higher than, and pays her Social Security, which many people don't, and pays her portion of Social Security as well as the employers. But, the woman is with my mother 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, then maybe gets 2 days off. None of you in this room are signing up for that. But you probably will when your parents or grandparents need care, and if you're affluent enough to hire in-home care. And those people giving that care should be citizens, in my view. But that argument is based on some sort of universal notion that people who contribute labor to a society ought to have a voice in a society. I'm not just affirming the difference of, yes, that this Ghanaian immigrant women should be able to sort of impart their traditions and customs to their children and shouldn't be told how to raise their children as long as it's not abusive. But I also think that everyone who contributes labor to society should have a voice in the governance of that society. And that's kind of a quasi-universalist argument. I can't prove it by picking up a rock and saying that the smartest person in the world or God or human nature says all immigrant workers should have a path to citizenship and Joe Schwartz is right. But I think that's an argument I want to make based on what I hope is all our commitment to democracy, equality, and pluralism. So I don't think difference, and I don't think a view that there aren't coherent, rational selves that can kind of, through reason and argument, come up with common decisions that aren't just the will to power of one group or another. I think that ultimately, if we really are Democrats with a small d, we have to struggle over what we hold in common as well as in what ways we are different. So thanks for listening, and now we can talk.